Hey, y'all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. Nice to be back with all of you. I'll tell you, it's been a while. We've been off for a week and a half as we were traveling about the country. So nice to see you all. Glad to have you back and really excited for you to meet and to talk with Leah Payne. She's a professor
Hi.
and an author. Hi, Leah. So good to see you. As we
Thank
often do, we like to talk about the weather. So how's the weather in Portland, Oregon?
Wow. Well, last week we had a huge ice storm, and so we had no school. And if you're the parent of small children like I am, that was like it was like basically another like a spring break slash Christmas break. So today it's back to normal, gloomy winter Portland weather. So
Hmm.
it's just raining, and I'm very happy about that. How's the weather where you are?
Oh, thank you. I am in Minneapolis, and the weather today is going to be 38 degrees, if you can imagine.
Okay.
That's after a long run of not good weather. And
Okay.
it's been wicked, wicked cold. Like, 20 below zero wind chills and just nonsense.
That is unacceptable coldness in
Yeah.
my mind.
So 38 degrees feels just wonderful. And Jim is telling us that, of course, things are lovely in Ventura, California. So, Jim,
Oh,
good
yeah,
to see you.
thanks a
And
lot.
sorry about shouting that comment. That shouldn't be that big. Uh, all right. Well, Leah, so glad to so glad to have you. And I feel an echo in my ears, and I don't know where it's coming from. Sometimes when we go away from our setup here, it just punishes us when we come back. So hope it sounds okay on your end.
It sounds
Um,
great.
Leah, this book that you've written called "God Gave Rock and Roll to You," and the history of contemporary Christian music. Seems like a really important one and kind of a
Oh, thank you.
peculiar topic in some ways, right? A lot of people
Yes.
wouldn't be like, so contemporary Christian music has something to do with the cultural situation in the United States currently. So thank you for the book, and
Thank you.
thank you for the earworm that now for the last 2 days has been in my head of me
Sorry.
singing "Kiss."
Sorry, not sorry.
God gave rock and roll to you. All right, so tell us about the book, and then I want to ask you about your teaching at Portland Seminary and some of the rest of this. But what
Sure.
got you into writing this book?
Well, I think your first comment that, wow, this seems like kind of a weird lens for looking at American culture and the culture of evangelicalism in particular. You're not the first person to say that. The first time I pitched this book to a scholarly editor, I said I want to look at how contemporary Christian music shaped the landscape of predominantly but not exclusively white evangelicalism, and I want to look at how it was the industry played an active role in creating the theology and politic of the evangelical world. So when I pitched it, I was all excited,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and the editor said, "Yeah, I don't get it. I don't get what's powerful about that." But I knew that contemporary Christian music, aka CCM, for people who were raised in evangelical circles, it was. First off, ubiquitous. There was
Mm-hmm.
almost no activity that did not include
Yep.
this music, and that it was extremely formative in almost every possible way. And so, fortunately, I found an editor who was willing to work with me on it. And a few years later, here we are. And so that's kind of the
Yeah.
short end, which is, yeah, I know it doesn't seem like it may be from the outside, and sometimes from the inside, because I think we dismiss things that are entertaining as being like less important.
Mm-hmm.
But if our current political landscape has shown us anything, it's that entertainment is quite powerful and can be very formative in people's lives. So the book is about how music shapes people and how this industry and kind of the broader evangelical media landscape has shaped our shared public life
Mm.
over time.
Now I apologize that I haven't yet read the book, but
No
I'm
problem.
assuming that part of it is not only how it shapes politics, but how important the contemporary Christian music movement was just in Christianity inside of it. Because those of us who are in that
Absolutely.
world, like we've all known that music carries more power than preaching, more power than writing, more power than typical theology. If you can sing it, you tend to follow it. We've known that for a very long time. I think your insights,
Yes.
though, from what I've seen of the book, is hey, and that didn't stay inside of that context. It actually spread more
Yes.
broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the book starts with in the early 20th century with one of the biggest political projects of the early 20th century was the temperance movement, which
Hmm.
led to the banning of the sale of to prohibition of
Hmm.
alcohol, and that the a lot of the women in particular who led the temperance movement recognized if you can get people singing about this, you can
Ah,
move them. And so the first chapter of the book is called "The Magic Power of Song," which is a quote from a temperance movement figure who noted that you could reform Paul and about the salvation that was found in sobriety. So that idea is certainly nothing new.
hmm. Hmm.
And yeah, you can really see, and I think for people who were raised in the predominantly white evangelical world of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they saw an industry grow in
Yeah.
profitability and in influence. And
Right.
most people who are familiar with it can testify to the fact that, yeah, it definitely shaped me as a person.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
look, in the religious world, people are like Martin Luther did it with the hymns.
absolutely.
The Wesleys in the Wesleyan movement, it was all about music. Hymns of churches. I mean, there's still churches that argue about hymns. You know that they want them because they preserve the faith. So that's
Yeah,
for sure the case. All right, so let's talk about what the industry was because
sure.
that is true. That thing you said where there wasn't an industry around rock music or folk music or kind of guitar drums music being church music. That really came on the scene. Can you just give for people who maybe
Sure.
feel like it's always been around or didn't recognize that that was a thing. Can you describe that
Yeah.
experience that some of us who were Christians in the for me it was early 1980s, for some in the 70s, kind of what that all meant when this
Sure,
thing was on
sure.
the rise?
Yeah, so I think in order to understand contemporary Christian music as an industry, a lot of people look at CCM as they start with rock. So they start with rock music and all of the tensions around rock, and then they look at contemporary Christian music through that lens. I want to look at it through the business end of things.
Mm,
So, not necessarily the sounds of rock, but the business and businesses that were associated with revival, with Christian revival. So, if you look at the businesses who created these really fascinating collections of songs,
yeah.
revival hymn books, you see the seeds of what becomes contemporary Christian music. So um, eventually, these revival movements in the early 20th century they create rock and roll. So
Interesting.
rock music is actually, there's a lot of conversation in the 1970s and 1980s about secular music and secular rock. Well, initially, rock comes out of revival movements and in Black and white holiness and Pentecostal movements. And so, contemporary Christian music is actually an inheritor of a much older tradition. And a lot of the themes, and I would love to hear what your favorite CCM music was
Yeah.
when you were coming of age, because a lot of those themes go way back. They go back actually, about 100 years. But who did you like to listen
Wow.
to when you were
Well,
growing
well,
up?
that's interesting. I saw that the squirrely prepper lifestyle person on YouTube popped in
Yeah.
that that Petra was a big deal,
Oh
um,
yeah, Petra is
and yeah,
huge.
it was to me too. In fact, just a few months ago, a year ago, I got to meet one of the people who was in Petra, and we've become friends. And I stayed at his house and stuff. So it
Oh,
was super
that's
fun, like for a
wonderful.
nerdy, yeah, kind of for someone like me. I got into Christianity when I was 16, and it really was music and kind of late Jesus movement stuff for me. I was a teenager
Okay.
in the 1980s, so that kind of vibe. Um, but I was kind of more into into real rock music. I mean, in my
Uh,
mind, so a lot of the Christian rock, like for some people I knew, Christian rock was like their chance to hear that kind of music and argue with their parents that it was okay, or with their youth pastor to
right.
say that this was okay. So they listened to, I don't know, Striper and all this other stuff. It's like, no, I just listen to Kiss. Like I don't need to listen to Striper.
Now, wait,
But
I gotta ask, did your parents, what did they say? Were they Christians? Like,
yeah, I
what was
wasn't
your
I
home
wasn't
like?
raised I wasn't raised religiously, so
Ah,
yeah, they didn't care. They were more worried that had become Christian. They were really worried
okay.
about that. Like, oh boy, our son has drifted into a cult of some kind. So they were worried about the Christianized version of me, not the secularized version. But I was a youth pastor and stuff, so I know how serious this stuff was. And I'll say, Leah, there was also a subtext. I feel like it was more in the early 1980s among the fundamentalist Christians that I knew that were opposed to rock music because of the 1/4 beat thing that came from African culture. And to hear you say that rock music was a part of Black Pentecostal gospel world, I'm
Mhm.
like, and then I think there was a racist piece to all of this that I didn't know at the time, but now I look back and I'm like, oh, that's what was going on. So there was
Yes,
some of that kind of just talk about drums but I was just like, that seems
absolutely.
utterly ridiculous to me that you wouldn't play music. Like to me, rock music was just music, and folk music and 70s guitar driven music was just music.
Yes, and I'm certainly not the first historian to point this out, but in the early days of a lot of the opposition to rock music, in fact, there's a great scholar named Randall Stevens who has written about how early responses to rock and roll, and in white circles, oftentimes anti-rock rhetoric was like a proxy conversation about civil rights and especially around issues like in the Jim Crow South and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
yes, race and racism are a huge part of that conversation. And then for Pentecostals, um, Black and white Pentecostals in the 1950s were oftentimes horrified to find that the types of music that were in their minds meant to be in service of God were being used for things that teenagers like, sex and
Yeah,
dancing and
sex, drugs, and
cars.
rock and roll.
And
Yeah.
so yeah, so for many of them it was just I've included a lot of conversation, a lot of the stuff that you just mentioned about the really racist overtones of conversation about rock, but also from Pentecostal communities that they are just horrified that their music has been used in such a
Wow.
they
Hmm.
see it as a downgrade because they want to be talking about God.
Hmm.
And one of the
Interesting.
funniest incidents of it is Jerry Lee Lewis, his Great Balls of Fire.
Hmm.
That is actually, in certain Southern Pentecostal circles, that was a reference to the Holy Spirit, descending on you
Oh,
like fire. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense. And then,
yeah.
can you imagine how scandalous it would be to have that phrase all of a sudden be used as a very, very thinly veiled reference to sex? So, I mean, it's hard to overstate how scandalous that was. But
Huh,
eventually,
huh.
um, those Christian communities, many of them found that they couldn't resist it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And they went all in and went for it.
mhm,
Um, okay, I want to talk about the industry, but what's your story
sure,
with this? Like, where were you raised in the Christian spectrum, and what years
sure.
were you in? And were you into contemporary Christian music as a?
Sort of, I was raised in a pastor's household. I am a West Coast Pentecostal pastor's daughter, and my parents were Bible college students in the 1970s in San Jose, California. So
Hmm,
that's right in there during kind of the end
okay,
of the Jesus movement. And so I was raised with all of my parents loved Jesus music. My first concert was a Chuck Girard concert. So some people viewing may remember Chuck Girard, but so I was raised in church with that music. Now, my dad is a real music fan, and he did not like contemporary Christian music. So, unlike many of my peers, when many of my peers were really enveloped in the world of contemporary Christian music in the 1980s and 1990s, my dad didn't like it, so he didn't want it in our home. So a lot of people who were my peers were raised with contemporary Christian music as a substitute form
Yeah.
of entertainment, and so I was and then wasn't in the world. But because I was charismatic, I mean, everybody knew who Carmen was. Everybody
Oh yeah.
knew. So of course I was totally aware of the world. But
But you were
so
listening to
yes and
just
no.
regular music, just like regular TV music and or
I
radio music and all that?
I was the I was a very nerdy person. People
Yeah.
sometimes tell me about how they liked contemporary Christian music, and they act a little bit embarrassed of it, which is sweet. But I liked something even nerdier, which was Broadway music. Very few teens
Oh, okay.
were so
Gotcha.
I was a big nerd.
Gotcha. Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
So just a different style. Yeah,
it was a
different style of
different
music.
kind of nerd. Yeah.
Well, Jim says in here that his style was modern Gregorian chant. So there are a lot
I
of
love
styles
it,
of music.
Jim. I love it.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this industry that was formed. You did a lot of interviews in the book, and you've tried to get inside and behind the curtain here of what was going on.
Mhm.
Can you name some names? Because history is a history of people and people doing things, right? And
Mhm.
we tend to organize history. And I don't want to say this to a theological historian like yourself in any way, but in the most positive terms. But when you're taught history or even look it up or something, it tends to be structured by events, what
Mm.
happened. And behind those events are people. And people do things. They make rules, they make laws, they do actions, and those are the things that then shape our world. You seem in the book to get into the people, like figuring out, hey, who are the people, and what did they
Sure.
do, and what were they up to, and what were their motivations? Do I have that right? And if so,
Oh,
what are some
yes.
of the highlights of the people?
Sure. Well, I think a couple of people who I would want to mention first would be the Benson family. So if you are familiar with Benson Records,
Mm,
two of the founders of Benson Records, John and Ava Green Benson, they were in a they went to an open air revival meeting in 1897 in an abandoned lot in Nashville, Tennessee.
mm,
And it was led by this pretty radical holiness preacher, and their lives were changed. And they responded by creating a printing press, or a publication company that they early on they had a newsletter and sermons and stuff like that, but right away the music was the thing that sold
mm,
the
mm.
most. So the Benson family created what would become one of the largest and most influential businesses in contemporary Christian music, and their children and future generations carried it on until eventually it was a record company. But the Bensons, from the Bensons, they're important because what you get from that are you see that there are holiness people. And if you don't know what holiness people are, there are people in the early 20th century who, late 19th, early 20th century, who have this pretty radical view of the Christian life and the role of the Holy Spirit to make someone entirely holy. And
Okay.
they are well known for certain codes for living. So, not drinking, not dancing, not gambling, and then, Bible reading and things like that. So, they were part of a movement that eventually became the Nazarene
Okay.
church. Yeah. So, and incidentally, like James Dobson, also a part of the Nazarene movement. So you start to see a group of people
Right.
who
Right.
are wanting to change the world, and make it more holy, make themselves and society more holy, and they see music as an opportunity to do that. So I think the Bensons, you have to know about
Great.
the Bensons. I think you have to know about a guy named Gerald McCracken, who was a Baylor University graduate in the 1950s. And he got a request from He was a Baptist. If you know many Baylor graduates from the 50s, most of them were Baptist. He got a request from a Baptist youth group to create to go and preach about Jesus and football, which is like the most Texan request I think I've ever heard of in my life.
Perfect. Yeah.
So instead of doing that, though, he created a drama. He was a sportscaster, and so he created a recording called "The Game of Life," that is a fictional football game between a Christian plays on the game of life against the forces of evil, coached by the Holy Spirit. And he created a record. He sent it to the youth group. It was hugely popular, caused a sensation, so successful. So many other youth pastors started asking for it that he created a record label that was based on the call station that he had created, this fictional sports game. And that call station was WORD, Word. So he created Word Records. So from that, you get
Word Records.
Word Records. Yeah. So from that, you get a Baptist with a desire to keep youth group kids in youth group. Yep. Right. So if you see those two people, I'm not even into the 1960s, but those two figures, really, you start to see the philosophy of contemporary Christian music, and the energy behind protecting young people and upholding certain conservative ideas and norms. And so for people who were raised in contemporary Christian music, they often, all of that stuff went without saying. People were just like, yeah, that's just how this is. You as an older convert may have been like, what are you guys, what's happening here? I don't know. Was that like for you?
Totally.
Were you kind of like, what?
Yeah. It was like, what? And, but it was like, I don't know, like when the guy from Kansas went over and started singing in the Christian music world, it was like, hey, all right, so it's kind of getting legitimate over there. And, or when Amy Grant went the other way, it was like, okay, this is real. I don't know, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Just negotiating the Christian role. But you do bring up an interesting point that I noticed a lot in those days, and it's come back in a way that I'm super afraid of, actually, which is that holiness movement, how connected it is to what a lot of us now refer to as a Christian nationalism movement. That the Christian nationalist idea is that America should be a holy country to fulfill the purposes of God. Not just holiness so that the purposes of God could be fulfilled through a church, but so the purposes of God could be fulfilled through the nation. And that a lot of that holiness stuff and a lot of the current contemporary music people, because now worship music has become the kind of contemporary music style, and it didn't used to be worship music. I almost remember the summer in 1993 when that happened, when Maranatha music sort of became the thing everybody listened to. But anyway, that Christian nationalist kind of holiness movement out of that. What was any of that part of the thinking that you were finding?
Yeah, I am usually pretty careful about how and where I use the phrase Christian nationalism, because I just want to make sure that I'm using it in a way that illuminates the people.
Yeah.
So what I'll say is this: is that one of the things that, if you look at holiness songbooks in the early 20th century, you will see a lot of patriotic songs. Yeah. You will see a lot of songs that are deeply concerned with the state of the nation, and especially the state of the young in the nation. So you will see visions of nationalism that, in those days, the big world events would have been World War I, right? So you're not going to see the exact same conversation, but you're going to see a very high priority. And this is, created in the segregated South. It is a very white dominated conversation. And it is glorifying a very nostalgic view of the United States. So you see that in the early days, and that never goes away. The idea that, that God has a special purpose. Now, it depends on which groups, because I think a lot of the groups that people apply the Christian nationalist label to now, I think those are kind of a later addition. A lot of those groups are very charismatic, And so and charismatics are sort of like it's hard, are they the children of Pentecostals? Are they the cousins of Pentecostals? A lot of times they have the same, they adopt many similar practices. So they sort of get all put together a lot of times. But those visions, I think a lot of those folks, they are charismatic. And this book looks at how charismatics have come to be the dominant strain in most evangelical
Yep.
circles. And they did it, I think, through music. They did it exactly what you said in the 1990s. Those charismatic communities, they had always been trading music back and forth across the world. This is a transnational movement, from the get-go. And their style, the way they do church, like the mega church model, people used to have in their minds a Baptist in their minds when they thought of mega churches, but they should have a charismatic in their minds in terms of, if we look at how they're worshiping, so I think that if you look at how even just the creation of in our modern, the way we use Christian nationalism now, of course, there's always been nationalism. There's always been Christian nationalists. But the way we use it now, I think a lot of those folks are people who have been fueled by this vision of the nation, that it's one thing, you said it exactly right. It's one thing to say something. It's another thing to sing it, because you're not just listening to someone, you are participating in it. So yes, it's throughout. Throughout.
Yeah. It's coming from your heart and not your head. It's just true. It's why I have a guitar hanging behind me. It's why we sing. It's the most human thing. And so the charismatic movement of the Jesus movement of the late 60s and early 1970s is deeply connected to what's referred to as the contemporary Christian music movement. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And that had a particular flavor to it, depending on where you were in the country, sort of the New York Woodstock crowd versus the Southern California Calvary Chapel crowd. And
right.
I think maybe it was in your book where I read this, when I read some excerpts online from the book, that the Jesus movement was rather short, but influential. Like it had a lot of. Yeah, you want to say something about that and how the music was because for some reason I remember the early days of like hippie kids, and man, I was one of them. Like I used to go to church with flip flops on and shorts to this little Baptist church on Sunday nights. With real music in the car. It was just confusing to these poor church people. Right. We were just into that Jesus stuff, as a teenager, and felt alivening and felt it didn't feel at all restrictive. It was freeing to a lot of us. So anyway, it was a whole different kind of story than what a lot of people who grew up in churches where Christianity was used as a thing to cap your life or to bottle you up. For new teenage converts, Christianity tend to feel like a freedom narrative from a life that felt sort of empty or was full of a lot of other struggles and pains. So really different perspectives. And I feel like that was some of what has never been reconciled inside Christianity in the last 45 years or so.
Yes, you're really right. And one of the things that I found fascinating was how charismatics, or I'll say this, how the Jesus movement was branded and essentially appropriated by conservative white evangelicals who were super smart to do that, by the way. So I like to think of the original generation of Jesus people as sort of like flappers. If you know anything about the early 20th century, my first book was about that. So flappers, they're those, like with the little dresses and the jazz. So flappers were actually like a tiny part of the American public, but they loomed large in the imagination of Americans. Like when people think of the 1920s, they think flappers. Well, there weren't that many of them. They were very kind of avant-garde. And anyway, so Jesus people, that is actually a really small group of people. The Jesus people who were former like teen hippie converts to charismatic Christianity in, you're right, all over the country, and kind of one of the big media hubs ended up being in Southern California. No coincidence. Southern California is a well-known media hub. But those young people were actually not the majority of people who would go on to adopt Jesus people aesthetics, like kind of the aesthetics of the anti-authority kind of, and also I would say the value for Jesus as a friend and intimacy with God. That ethic became very quickly appropriated by conservative evangelical media makers. And I'm not the first person to say this at all, but there's a famous gathering of evangelical kids called Explo 72, which many people talk about as the inciting incident that creates the category of contemporary Christian music.
Yeah.
But it was a well-known event, if you know anything about that world, where Billy Graham and a number of other influential evangelicals invited a bunch of young people who were essentially the church kids to a gathering where they heard from Jesus people, Jesus music people. So people like Larry Norman in second chapter of Acts, like those types of musicians were seen as really valuable partners in encouraging young people to adhere to conservative evangelical Christianity. It was very effective. So I think of one time I heard if everyone who said they'd been to Woodstock descended on Woodstock, it'd be 10 times. And it's sort of like that. If everyone who said they were an actual Jesus person were, that's no, but they like to remember themselves in that way. I think in large part because they were iconic, right? These were just, and the songs that they wrote, unlike a lot of, there had been a lot of stops and starts that I document where conservative evangelical media makers were trying to come up with rock substitutes. Yeah. So they kept trying different things and they weren't having very much success. And what Jesus music did was it was music created by young people for young people. And those young people were being trained as Christians by a set of pastors who were pretty conservative, charismatic pastors, people like Chuck Smith and Jack Hayford and John Wimber. And that was for very smart evangelical media makers like Billy Graham, that was an entry point it was like cracking a code because they had been really wrestling with rock and roll. They tried forbidding it. That did not work, right? Especially because you have a generation of teens. And, the very first thing if you want a teen not to do something, at least an American teen, is to tell them, to do it. So it was a tremendous opportunity. And then the floodgates just opened because all of a sudden there was this idea oh my goodness, we could train young Christians up in the very form of media that we had thought would lead them to damnation. It could be the source of their salvation. Yeah. And it was just a free for all. It was like a boom in creating music that was made for that purpose. I'm sorry, I just talked so much.
No, you talk all, that's what you're on here for. Talk as long as you want.
I'm so not used to interviews.
You just start talking and keep going. Okay. So Leah, one of the things that I think existed maybe at least by the 1990s, maybe the 1980s, were colleges, especially charismatic colleges, that had music production majors in them.
Yes.
They took this stuff so seriously that you could go to college and people still can do this, but I don't know, for some reason it feels more legitimate now. The places you could go to music school was Berkeley College of Music and North Central Bible College, where they would have a music thing. So did the whole system just sort of buy into this, or were they thinking, hey, there's big money making opportunity here? How was that all?
That's a great question. So one of the things that I look at is how contemporary Christian music was built on development networks that were church-based, but also dependent on this big web of evangelical parachurch organizations and colleges and even coffee shops. And there was this vast network, and Christian colleges, um, many contemporary Christian music artists came up through
Yeah.
Christian colleges. So that was very popular. But what I hear in what you're saying is sort of the off the book schools, which that is super
Hmm.
interesting. So places like Christ for the Nations,
Yeah.
Rhema Bible College, these
Yeah.
very, very
Right.
charismatic um, uh, organizations, those places. I'm so glad you asked about that, because those places created generations of contemporary worship leaders who, and by the way, they're all over the world, because
Hmm.
people sent people from all over the world to come to Christ for the Nations. And so if you actually follow the music, you can follow the ideology as it goes
Ah,
all over the place. And I think that's something that, if you're not taking the music seriously, then you miss it. And so a lot of people have been very surprised that there's an international
yeah.
kind of back and forth with evangelical folks, or that there's political affinities between like the United States and Brazil or Guatemala or these other
Hmm.
places.
Hmm.
Well, that's not surprising to anybody who knows about
Yeah.
those media relationships. And by the way, these are like close friends and family friends. It's not
Totally.
just the fact that they like the music, it's that they know and they trust each other. And many of them share that common
Right.
experience of exactly what you said, those charismatic
Yeah.
music schools.
They came in, did a youth retreat, or came in, did something at their church, stayed with the family. Like that's the thing that people often miss in any
Hmm.
movement. Uh, So you
Yes.
take conservative Christian movements or political movements or whatever. It's people who know each other and spend time with each other in not just formal spaces, right? It's like it's super easy, and people do a lot of this to tell the stories of any movement by, like
Hmm.
the big conferences, right? So I don't know, you mentioned Expo 72, and then there was some other gathering in Washington, D.C. And like you could stack,
Yes.
and then a music festival that starts, and you can stack together a dozen events over a dozen years and sort of see who ran them, where did the money come from. But it was all
Yes.
the 364 days in between those those events, when this whole network is being formed and shaped and developed, people moving around, marrying each other's, kids marrying, and bands, and just all of that. The-
Yes, my friend Erica Ramirez and we wrote an article in Religion News Service about an event that the Trump administration held, where they invited a bunch of worship leaders and contemporary
Mhm.
Christian music people into the White House. And there were people like Michael Tate and Carrie Job.
Yep.
And it didn't get as much attention as I thought it should. We were trying to draw attention to it because we were saying, listen, Carrie Job is not a household name, maybe in, like the kind of circles where political pundits are going back and forth about,
Yeah.
this current election cycle. But she is in a charismatic church service, and she had just had one of the biggest hits, one of the biggest pandemic hits. She'd been in almost everybody's home with this song called "The Blessing."
Mhm.
Um, and so it is a big deal when when she's on all of her social media platforms vouching for the Trump administration. And that's something that I think, I, and I've asked around, and I'm not sure who the architect of that is in the Trump administration, but someone, or probably more than one person, understands how those networks work and
Yep.
was very diligent about developing those relationships.
Yeah, and certainly true with the Trump administration, and I try to work in this intersection of evangelical faith and politics, and
Maybe do you
Well,
know who it is?
yeah, I do. But one side of the equation, Republicans have a very sophisticated understanding of those networks. The other
Yes.
side of the equation, the other big political party, the Democrats, not only have no clue, they're totally uninterested. Like they know they could not care any less, right? They're just like,
Ugh.
oh my gosh, those people, which is only a problem because they represent so many people, that contemporary Christian movement and the Christian subculture that really, I mean, I think you're one of the unique voices pointing out that this is connected to songs and musicians, not just individual pastors or institutions. And
Mm.
that is what a lot of us have always recognized. Um, and your scholarly piece, by the way, an Oxford Press piece, we should say,
Oh, thanks.
right? So you're not, you're
Thank
not
you.
just, you didn't just, publish with Baker Books or anything.
Self-published. Yeah.
You went to
Oh, no.
Oxford
I love
Books.
Baker. Baker
I
does
do
great
too.
stuff.
They published me. They published me piece. Yeah, all for them. But Oxford Press, like this is right. So like you're making a statement at a level of scholarship, not just no one would think you would write a book that's basically extended blog posts like some of us have spent a career writing.
Oh, brother.
You've written books of much more consequence. Um, to 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 name this and to point this out, that look, that the experience of individual Christians in America is not through pastors or
Right.
institutions or even churches. It really comes through like groups and music and honestly, I know we're not talking about this, but these little devotionals that people read and stuff every day.
100%.
It's the drip, drip, drip stuff. It's not Greg Locke yelling at people from some church in Tennessee. Like that is just not how it goes.
Yes, I appreciate you saying that in part because I know a lot of pastors, and I know many of them are um, baffled a little and exhausted by how little their voice influences their congregation. um, and there are so many reasons for that. But I appreciate how you pointed out the little things, the drip, drip, drip of the greater media landscape.
Mm-hmm.
For most of its history, contemporary Christian music was distributed through Christian bookstores, which were, it's hard to overstate, like young people, if you don't know what a Christian bookstore is, at the time, for a while, they were the cultural hub
Yeah.
of evangelicalism. And that's where people were buying all these things at the same time. So
Yep.
the primary buyers of contemporary Christian music, or at least the people who the industry imagined themselves marketing to, and they did it really well. So I think they were probably right.
Yeah, they
What
did.
they were Christian bookstore moms. So moms who were concerned about their children and the music they were listening to.
Mm-hmm.
Those moms would buy a lot of different things. So music for their kids, Bible studies for themselves, maybe a Christian novel,
Yep.
and t-shirts. There was just a ton of merchandise that it's exactly what you said, that the Christian liturgy typically happens, if you're like me and you were raised charismatic, it might go on indefinitely, but usually it's around,
Yeah.
an hour and a half. And that's only a short period of time compared to what you listen to in the car when you're taking
Yep.
your kids, around town, what you and your family watch in the
Mm-hmm.
evenings, so I think uh, I think you're 100% right. And what I hope to draw people's attention to are the unofficial ways that they are formed politically and theologically, because the official
Yeah.
structures are in duress and in many cases are in sharp decline.
Yep.
So, like, denominational affiliation is in sharp decline, but I'm guessing, and believe pretty strongly that there are still people who feel they are still being formed, even as
Mm-hmm.
the institutions are in decline.
Yeah.
Um, and you're seeing it all. You see it on the ground level. I'd love to hear your thoughts on just how, like, music and the worship world is forming the people you're talking to.
Yeah. Look, for sure, it is the thing, and a lot of the people who end up working in our spaces travel with us. Like when we're on through 2024, we'll be out on a bus for a week or two at a time, and then back home for a little bit of respite, and then back out and like this. A lot of the people who travel with us or that we meet, many of them have come from these conservative Christian backgrounds, and these songs are the song tracks still in their heads, even though politically, theologically, socially they've continued to grow. those songs are still they're still deeply in there. Like a lot of the songs that you hear in formative ages, they just become a piece of your mind. There's no separating it. Like you don't have a thought that didn't have that song that was there at the same
Oh,
time, right? It's
100%.
beautiful. That's one of the great things of music. Um, so yes, it is the thing, and there is not an alternative for it currently. Like
Mm,
that's one of the things that every social movement always has music with it. So people talk about this
mm,
regularly in movement theory. There's not a current music that feels like some of the social movements that many of us want to see happen in America. There aren't songs. There might
mm.
be an occasional chant, but they're usually dot 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 dot. Like it's not musical. Um, there's series of statements, right? So there's a missing piece in social movements, but not in the Christian movement. And the thing that's happened in the conservative Christian movement is that contemporary Christian music has made this pivot to worship music.
Mm, mhm.
And so the best-selling songs on Spotify are Christian, praise music or worship music. That's an entire genre. There's whole radio stations. You just turn on a radio station, and all it is, you know, uh, Jesus be my lover, praise and worship music that people really like. Like they really, really like it. Do you have any
Absolutely.
thoughts about that movement when the contemporary Christian movement became the praise and worship music? And then the songs in there, it's a lot of triumphalism. It's a lot of
Absolutely.
enemies and winning over our enemies. And then you're just inserting, your neighbor or somebody disagrees with you on social issues or politics. You just slot that into the enemy category, and now you've got an anthem, and you're ready to roll.
Yeah, I write about the worship industry ascend. There's two different ways of looking at it. Did it ascend, or is it what's left of
Oh,
contemporary Christian music? And I think in terms of profitability, it is by far it has outstripped what we would think of as contemporary Christian music. And I define contemporary Christian music as the primary goal of it is entertainment. It's like a parallel universe of contemporary of
okay.
conservative evangelical entertainment that's kind of was supposed to run side by side with pop culture, but usually lagged behind. And worship music is liturgical in function, at least in theory. A lot of people don't actually go to worship services, but they listen to worship music, as you mentioned. So it doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily, you don't have to actually be there to consume it. So worship music is, I think, the, for all intents and purposes, proof that charismatic Christianity is ascendant
Yeah.
in evangelical spaces, because the vast majority of people who create worship hits are from charismatic or Pentecostal churches.
Hmm.
And I think that it can be used in, the fascinating thing is, in some ways, it's ostensibly apolitical, but if you actually take the claim seriously, it's deeply political in the sense that
Hmm.
it is making concrete claims about the lordship of Jesus or the kingdom of God. And you can, as you mentioned, you can apply it in a lot of different ways. One example that I use is the song Waymaker, which has a really fascinating history. And I know time is short, so I won't give you the whole history, but what I'll say is that people use that on the left and the right as a protest anthem. And so I think it can be used in many ways. And it's
Mm-hmm.
worth saying that there are plenty of charismatics and Pentecostals, particularly Black Pentecostal and charismatic Christians, who would not identify as Trumpers, or
Hmm.
there are people who dissent. But I will say there's no doubt that the conservative activist class of evangelical folks are um, energized by worship music and utilize it at almost every opportunity, because it's what you mentioned. They understand its power, and it's fascinating to me how well some people understand it and are able to wield it, and how little others don't.
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's like stunning because you can watch it happen. Like I was talking to somebody who was at a Reawaken America conference, and they use a lot of worship music
Yeah.
there. And it's like, I've seen footage where it's just like a Pentecostal worship service. And I was talking to the person who is not a Christian, who was there to observe, and was like, I have to say I was moved. And so even if you're,
Yeah. Totally. I've been
it'll
to those
get
too.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. It
Yeah,
works. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's very convincing. And, I don't fault folks for using that style of music some of which they've actually helped generate. Like there's an entire formula, and I know many of those people very well, and talked for years about those formulas. Chris Tomlin and I have known each other a long, 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 long time, and he was working on that formula way back. So
Sure, there are some excellent pop writers
yeah,
who write worship music. Yeah.
and I'm a bit of a new guitar player, and so I watch a lot of guitar YouTube channels to learn stuff and to sort of get in the culture. And
Ooh, interesting.
about half of it is church worship leader guitar stuff. Like I swear, the majority of people who play guitar in front of groups are doing it in churches. They're not doing it at open mics. They're not doing it in bars. They are doing it in churches. And there's a lot of people that whole thing has just really advanced, and really sophisticated music, frankly, and we're not just talking about what church music has become, but if people don't know, it's rather sophisticated and expensive equipment stuff for
That's right.
a certain tremolo sound that they really want to get. And they've got a $700 pedal to make it happen for that one song where that thing. So it's just its own little weird dive world. But if people think contemporary Christian music was just a past thing, it's new iteration. But that comment you just made, I'm fascinated by. Like, is it the ascendancy of it, or is it just the leftovers of what there was?
Yeah, it's hard to say, because I think there's still artists who are finding, there are artists who would not be considered, who back in the heyday of CCM would not have charted, but are finding audiences.
Huh,
I think a lot of it has to do with the way that we consume media,
huh,
so it's smaller, what you said about the protest anthem. Um, I mean, some of that is sort of just like there's magic in creating
yeah.
something like that. Like, who knows how, one of the anthems that I trace here is God's Not Dead, which has a really interesting history, as well. But the most familiar, the version that people might be most familiar with is by the Newsboys. And it has been made into a film, and it kind of very, very like at the center of like culture war
Yeah.
stuff. And but that song, just even the title, it lets you know a lot about what it's
Hmm.
going to be
Hmm.
about.
Hmm.
And I think, I think there are people who are creating music, but in terms of an alternative, there there's just this broad media landscape. People
Yeah.
listen on Spotify, on YouTube, on
Hmm.
so it's harder to come up with like, okay, everybody, here's the song. It's kind of
That's
an
right.
organic process.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
because we don't have all this, we don't share the same media. Back in the day, Contemporary Christian Music Magazine was like a hub where everybody would,
Yep.
um, and and we have a much more diverse country, and we have a much more diverse way of consuming media. So
Hmm.
it's a different world.
Leah, you do a lot of other things. One of those is in 2 minutes, you have to go to teach a
Sure.
class of students. So
Yes.
you just say, whenever we have a professor that has to leave to teach a class, we want to know, what are you teaching them, and how come adults can't
Oh,
learn? How come adults can't learn what the college people get to learn? So,
Oh,
what are you
well,
teaching? What's your
I'm
class?
teaching a history of Christianity in America to adult learners, to seminarians. So we are talking about the beginnings of the Great Awakening. The so-called Great Awakening. Is it Great Awakening? We'll talk about that. And so we're going to be talking about revivalism, which seems appropriate given our conversation. So it should be a fun conversation.
So the other thing I ask a lot of professors when they teach interesting things, like our astrophysicist that's on with us on Thursdays, can you
Ooh,
just
fun.
turn on the voice memo on your phone and record what you're about to teach, and then post it up somewhere so the rest of us can listen to it? Because I promise you, we're just doom scrolling, and there's something much more interesting going on in that classroom.
Oh,
So
Come join me in class. We have a lot of fun.
I'll send you an iPhone if you'll make a recording. Hey,
Okay.
and speaking of podcasts, in the last 30
Sure.
seconds, you have a podcast of your own?
Yes, I have a couple of a religion and pop culture podcast called Weird Religion that I co-host with my friend who's a Bible scholar, and we just tackle all kinds of fun and interesting topics. And then I have a one called Rock That Doesn't Roll, the story of Christian rock, which is about the fans of contemporary Christian music, or mostly Christian rock, because it CCM was a lot of different genres, and their how their lives have been shaped by CCM. So I would welcome anybody to
We will
listen
tell
along.
people about that, and they can search Leah Payne, spelled Leahpayne. If you're listening on just the podcast version, don't want to look below. And so search in your podcast places for Leah Payne. Leah, thank you so much. I look forward to many more
Thank you.
conversations with you, and all the best on the book. God Gave Rock and
Likewise.
Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music and Why It Matters in America. All right.
Thank you.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.